One of Berne's first books was called The Layman's Guide to Psychiatry and Psychoanalysis, first published under the title of The Mind in Action. It was published in 1947. This was while Berne was still a psychoanalyst, even before he got into TA. He was very concerned about putting therapist and client on equal footing by having them be able to understand the language of therapy that was being used. So in this book, he basically translates psychoanalytic theory into everyday, ordinary English language. So that was his first attempt to really help clients have the basic language of psychotherapy. His first book on transactional analysis and psychotherapy was published in 1961, and is still a fascinating book to go back and read in terms of his early development of the basic ideas in TA. In '64, he published what was probably his most influential book, popular book, Games People Play, which was kind of a thesaurus of life games, psychological games that people tend to play. And that's still available on newsstands in airports and bookstores all over. I see it constantly on shelves. It still sells very well. In '66, he wrote his first book on the structure and dynamics of organizations and groups, applying TA to the analysis of organizations and groups in general. In the same year, he wrote a book on psychotherapy groups, which is called The Principles of Group Treatment. In 1970, he wrote a book called Sex and Human Loving, which was originally came from a series of lectures to Stanford medical students on sexuality. And it's a very humorous book. He makes up four-letter words that he uses throughout the book to describe different sexual functioning and so forth. So, and he had a very dry British wit. So it has some new ideas about TA in that book, but most of it is about his own perceptions of the humor of sex. His opening statement is, "Sex is wet." And he goes on from there. And in 1972, which was 2 years after his death, the book he was working on at the time of his death, What Do You Say After You Say Hello, which is a book on life scripts, was published in his honor. Jack Doucet, one of his early students who was a psychiatrist in San Francisco, drew together his manuscript that he was working on at the time and published that, which is really one of the best books on life scripts. Yeah, right. Claude Steiner also drew together a lot of Berne's previous articles on games and scripts and published a book called Beyond Games and Scripts that has Berne's name on it in 1976. In 1977, Paul McCormick wrote a little monograph, as I mentioned earlier, on intuition and ego states, which was the collection of 5 articles that Berne had written earlier, looking at the early development of his ideas of ego states from his studies on intuition.